Hi everybody, this is Juliana from the Fall 2019 EFWE team, and this video is going to be more on discussing the effort side of things. I'm not going to go that deep into it because if you do have to interact with that part, it's not going to be super in-depth. You probably need to know how to create different API functions, how to add tables to the database. So that's what I'm going to go through here. So this graph is in the main page, the Confluence page for effort. You are going to go to the effort architecture. So there's also another graph here, the deployment graph, that's really useful. So you can look at that too, but I'm going to talk about the layers of the effort project. So this layer has more to do with the EFWE team, I believe, and the same with the business layer. So what you would probably mostly be interacting with is the API and creating different functions and the database, adding things to the database and whatnot, and how to do that in the API section. And you would also be interactive. If you want to add a table, you have to interact with this entities projects. So the entities is what represents all the tables. I'm going to show it in a bit. So they're classes defined for every table in the database. So to create a new table, you would have to create a new entity as well. So I'm going to go through these aspects because that's what mostly you would be working with. If you have any questions about this, and there's probably videos on the EFWE playlist. So all of these layers are represented in the Visual Studio solution as different projects. So you see the business layer, the data access layer is what actually interacts with the database. So that is the farthest layer. The top layer would be the business layer and this effort layer because it has the views, and then this is what you mostly would be interacting with, the web API. So the API functions will all be again in the controller. So you can see all of these controllers would have different API functions. And just if you need to know, these are mostly called here in the business layer. So there's a bunch of managers that correspond to the controllers that call these different API functions. So another thing to keep in mind is that there's this legacy folder, and there's probably one in a lot of these projects. And this is where code that we used to use is kept. This is not code that is implemented right now. So I'm guessing it was kept because there's some functionality that hasn't been reinstated. So if you need to see it, I had to reinstate some of the functionality in the Forex controller. If you look at here how it was before, that it used a different layer system, you can get an idea of how to reinstate that. So I'm going to show you an example of what I had to do to create API functions and do these API functions that added row of data into the database. So it's like a multi-layered process, so it's a little complicated, but it's really it repeats all the time, so it's the same for everything. So one of these, this one's more difficult. I'm going to show a simple one. So I have this API function, but I want to pass in this, which is an entity. I'm going to talk about it. I had to create an entity in this folder because I had to, where's the entity? Here in this project, each of these would represent a table in the database. So if I go to the Forex order one that I created, you're going to see that I have the table name and what schema. So this means like I want it to be in the Forex schema and I want it to be called order. Okay, and you can see that if I open it here, you're going to see that all of the columns are the same that I have. You see, the same that are defined here. The only thing you don't need to define is the, let me see, it is the ID created at, updated at. All of these that are on every table are already, since we are inheriting from base entity has those columns that will be on every table. So if you just inherit it from it, you'll have it. And required just means that it can't be null. So be careful with that, because sometimes I would put required on everything and I'd have things that were null and it will give an exception. So once you create this, it's not going to show up in your database. You would have to do all the data migration all over again, and then it would show up on your table when you refresh this. So yeah, that's how you would create a new table. So in the controller, I am getting an input of this object. So whenever I talked about this in a video before, I think on Postman, but whenever you have an object here as an input, it means that whatever you're getting in the body of your request will be a JSON with all this information. So for me, this log order, I think it's over here. This log order would look like this, okay? So it's a JSON that I'm passing in with all of the columns in Forex order that I want to log in. So what you will need to do is create I'm using the already existent Forex service, but if you are creating a whole new, all of the controllers have a service that goes with it. So you would use that, but if you have to create a new controller class, you would have to create a new service class with it. So I think it's over here. So in the service, you have an interface where you would declare this log order function here, and what you would just do is pass the same thing and call a repository. So for this, you would need a specific repository since you want to add a different object. So if you were, since I have to add this Forex order, I don't have a repository since it was a new entity that takes in something like this. So let's go to the Forex order repository. So you can create an interface. I don't need to put anything here. If you have, you would want to do other actions with the data, maybe like you have to do some calculations, you would put a new function here, but since it is inheriting from base repository, you already have these that you have to implement, okay? So you would have to implement all of these, so I'm only going to use the add function, so I really don't need to implement any new function, okay? So also in the Forex service, to use your repository that you create, you have to pass in the interface. Make sure it's in the interface, because I've seen errors come about from not passing in the interface. So pass in the interface and just do it like this in the constructor, and you won't have to modify anything else. You would just pass it like that. So let's go and look at the actual functions in my repository that I implemented. And also, I didn't mention this, but the repository, since I said the data access project is where all of the actual data manipulation is happening. They are all in here, so you can see the interfaces there and the repositories here. So I have one for order here, and you can see I'm implementing all of the required by the interface classes, so you can really get these from, they're all pretty much the same. You don't need to do much changing, just change the parameters to the object, the entity you want. And here the only thing, when you update, you have to update each column that you have in your specific table, so you would put all the columns from that table. And I'm going to show you an example of a repository where somebody added an actual different function and didn't use just the add function. So over here, I think somebody added a log function. Yeah, this is a new function that somebody added instead of just using the ones from the base. So if you want to add just a function to do some manipulation on data, so maybe you don't want to add all the data, you want to add, if something is something, you want to add that data, so you would do it in a function like this. And if you want to see the actual, here, what it looks like, it just puts the two new functions in here, declares them, and yeah. And it still has to implement the ones from the repository, the base repository, like add, update, and get all, get, and all of those. Okay, so that is basically it. So the layers to get data or do anything with data from the controller is controller, service, repository, and you would have to have entity and entity that you would use. So again, an entity is just the representation of the table. Okay, so that is all for this video. I hope you understood and I explained everything sufficiently.